I just rewatched License to Kill. Every big James Bond movie fan has their ranking of their least favorite and most favorite James Bond movies. License to Kill isn't usually up there on the top of people's rankings, but maybe it should be. It is unfortunately one of the more forgotten James Bond movies. If you were to wrangle up about 100 random James Bond movie fans and just say, hey, name 3 random James Bond movies, almost nobody will say License to Kill. Well, I'm one of those guys that might actually say it because this is one of the movies I loved as a kid. I grew up on this movie. I love License to Kill. Not the best, but really, really good.
Timothy Dalton is James Bond 007.
And I think it's unfortunate that it sort of slipped through the cracks because, let's face it, Timothy Dalton only had 2 James Bond movies. Roger Moore had a whole lot more. The only person to have fewer is George Lazenby with On Her Majesty's Secret Service, but at least that movie gets more recognition. So what's different about License to Kill? Why does it not register with some people as one of the great movies? It is quite a bit different, so let's talk about it.
When you get on his bad side, your number is up.
Every James Bond movie has similar attributes. There's things that are similar between all the films, but each film tries to do something a little bit unique. If you were to say, hey, it's the James Bond movie with all the underwater stuff, you'd be talking about Thunderball. Hey, I'm thinking about the James Bond movie where they tried to rob Fort Knox. Well, that would be Goldfinger. Well, License to Kill, that's the one where James Bond goes rogue, and it's a revenge-inspired story. He's not on a mission. He's out for personal revenge, which is very different from any other James Bond movie. This movie's also a little bit unique as being the final John Glenn directed movie. John Glenn, not to be confused with the astronaut. John Glenn directed 5 James Bond movies, more than anyone else. Second place goes to Guy Hamilton, who directed 4 James Bond movies. John Glenn is unique that he directed every single James Bond movie that was filmed in the 80s. So if somebody says, hey, think of 1980s James Bond, it was John Glenn directing. He did both Timothy Dalton movies. He did 3 of the Roger Moore movies. I'll do videos on those at another time. So if you want to watch more James Bond related content, please hit that like and subscribe button. I talk about a lot of different types of movies and stuff. It's not just James Bond. So hit that like and subscribe button so you don't miss what's happening in the future. James Bond movies are famous for having really interesting opening sequences, and this movie has a good one. It's sort of unique. James Bond is in southern Florida to go to the wedding of his longtime friend and companion, Felix Leiter. Felix Leiter works for the CIA. James Bond works for British intelligence. US and UK are allies, so naturally they got along. They were on missions together. Felix Leiter is in the books. Felix Leiter is in previous James Bond movies. So Bond is here to celebrate his wedding. On their way to the wedding, well, wouldn't you know it, stuff's happening. So they abandon the limousine, get into a Coast Guard helicopter, and go chase after a bad guy that just escaped. Bad guy played by Robert Davi, D-A-V, I'm not quite sure on the pronunciation of it, but he is fantastic as Frank Sanchez in this movie, the main villain. I won't go into all of the plot points, but suffice to say that James Bond catches up with the bad guy, and they get him in one of the more interesting sequences I've seen in a Bond movie. This is probably one of my top 10 favorite James Bond action sequences, where the Coast Guard helicopter overtakes the little airplane that he's escaping in, that the U.S. government doesn't want him to escape to Cuba. So James Bond gets lowered from a helicopter with a vest with the James Bond music going full throttle, da-da-da-da-da-da, and he wraps a cable around the back of the airplane and the helicopter hoists it away. Pretty neat action sequence, especially knowing that it was all filmed practically. Not any CGI to be noted in the movie. All practical effects, which I really like. I think it adds a level of realism. And that's one of the things about this movie. It was really going for realism. It wanted to be a more grounded, Earth level Bond movie. He's not chasing after villains and volcanoes. He's not going up into space. He's not doing anything exotically weird. He's just going on a revenge-filled rampage. So what causes him to go on the revenge-filled rampage? Well, after we get the opening credit sequence with the License to Kill theme song, turns out Felix Leiter's wife was murdered, and Felix Leiter was fed to the sharks and left for dead. This really pisses off James Bond. James Bond's bosses at MI6 don't want him to take revenge. They want him to go do another assignment. They want the American government to handle it, which from their perspective makes sense. Felix Leiter was an American agent, but Bond took this personally, so he says he's going to resign, but they don't let him. They try to fire him instead. And in a very cool line, they say, "Your license to kill has been revoked," as if it was an actual license that somebody would carry, like issued by the DMV. Don't know how to apply for license to kill, but I guess it could come in handy. Anyway, James Bond doesn't want to go with them, so he escapes. They actually shoot at him as he's trying to escape, which is kind of interesting. I guess MI6 really isn't something you retire from. So James Bond goes to the fictional country of Valverde, or was it Corto Maltese?
Crap, crap. Ah. Now that's good work.
No, that's right. It's the Republic of Isthmus, whatever. It was filmed in Mexico, but it's a fake country that doesn't exist. Bond goes there as a assassin. He tries to get into the Frank Sanchez organization by going to a casino, a very James Bondy thing to do, wins a boatload of money, catches the attention of the casino owners, and he's brought up to Frank Sanchez, where he introduces himself as a problem eliminator, which I thought was pretty cool. There are also some sequences where they show that Frank Sanchez is really the one in charge of this republic. They show the president of this fictional country, sort of bribery and government corruption. Sanchez says to the president, "Remember, you're only president for life."
You're only president for life.
Which I thought was a pretty neat little cool thing. Makes you realize that this bad guy really is legit in the evil villain sort of way. Even though James Bond is rogue and he's not supposed to be there,
I'm not even supposed to be here today.
Q shows up. I think that's a nice little touch. Q is sort of a connecting tissue between multiple James Bonds and multiple James Bond movies. This movie starts to not really feel like a Bond movie, and then Q shows up and reminds us that it actually is a James Bond film. And of course, Desmond Llewellyn is perfect in the role of Q. Gives him some much needed gear, a little bit of comic relief. This is an alarm clock guaranteed never to wake up anybody who uses it. Good stuff. It's nice to have him in the movie, even though Bond is supposed to be rogue. Apparently Q is going rogue as well because he wants to help his longtime, I don't want to say partner, friend, whatever. They sort of have a antagonistic relationship. Q and 007 have some playful banter, but it's always friendly. So it's nice to see that Q would actually go out of his way to help Bond out in the field, even though he probably wasn't supposed to. He's probably risking his career to do so. I thought it was really a nice touch. So anyway, Bond uses the exploding toothpaste to break the window and try to kill the bad guy, but the bad guy gets away because a ninja attacks. This is still a James Bond movie after all, so even though it's Central America, we still have ninjas because people from the Far East are negotiating drug deals with Frank Sanchez. So we get that. We get lots of chases. We get lots of fights. Eventually, Bond infiltrates the organization, and we get a lot of the inside stuff about how this evil organization works. They have a really interesting gimmick where Wayne Newton plays a televangelist who is on TV giving secret codes where people are bidding and passing messages right on live television. I thought that was a really neat touch, pretty unique. Shows that this organization really is international. It's really a big deal, and it's probably going to be a good thing that James Bond takes it down. Better for the world, even though he's not really supposed to be there.
I'm not even supposed to be here today.
Action ensues. There's a really cool chase sequence with semis that are loaded up with a mixture of cocaine and gasoline. Somehow there's a process to extract the cocaine from the gasoline. Boom, explode, fire. All that's pretty cool. And this movie has one of the best bad guy deaths of any James Bond movie. Bond usually kills the bad guy, except for maybe the leader Spectre. He's around for a couple movies, but Bond usually kills the bad guy.
Right.
Earlier, when Felix's wife was murdered, and Felix was left for dead after being dangled as shark food, takes Felix's lighter. And then he uses the lighter to ignite Frank Sanchez, who's covered in this cocaine gasoline mess. I think this is actually an intentional pun. I don't know, but he used Felix Leiter's lighter. I really like this movie because it has a smaller scale. Even though the drug cartel is a gigantic organization, it's not somebody launching rockets out of a volcano. It's not somebody trying to start World War III. It's not somebody trying to exterminate all life from spaceships. It's really a street-level, realistic Miami Vice type of movie. It's Miami Vice meets James Bond is probably the best way to describe this movie, mixed with a little bit of Death Wish, your 80s action revenge thrillers. It even kind of sounds like the title of a Steven Seagal movie, License to Kill, Hard to Kill. It's just kind of a similar tone. I'm just really glad that they didn't give James Bond a ponytail. let's limit the 80s-ness a little. I don't think audiences were ready for a darker James Bond. They were used to the sort of upbeat, kind of playful Roger Moore style James Bond, the suave James Bond. I don't think audiences were really for the shock of a dark, gritty James Bond. A lot of similarities to the Daniel Craig James Bond, actually. We had to go for a more traditional James Bond with Pierce Brosnan, who I think was born to play the part of James Bond. And then Daniel Craig was a more gritty James Bond like Timothy Dalton. I really wish Timothy Dalton would have had more than 2 movies, but then again, we wouldn't have gotten GoldenEye, which I really love. So we're going to talk a lot more about the Bond movies. I'm going to kind of go through these one at a time, intermix some other reviews and other reactions of other things along the way. So if you want to see all of that stuff, hit that like and subscribe button. Let me know what you think. Which James Bond movies do you like? Which James Bond movies, not so much? Thank you very much for watching. Until next time.